We have a quorum, so we should get going. As you see here, notice that we are recording this session as we have every other one of our webinars. I think this is number 19 in our series, and we are delighted to welcome you today. My name is Chris Denby, founder and CEO of the Advisory Board for the Arts, and will be your moderator for today's session, Motivating Your Teams Through Crisis. This is a little bit of a different type of webinar than the other ones we have done, although thematically connected, and I will explain that in a moment. I do hope you get a lot out of this. It's on a complicated topic, one that is incredibly important in our opinion, and hopefully we will contribute a little bit to your efforts on this critical issue. We are really blessed to be joined today by two panelists who are true experts in this field, Brodie Riordan and Perry Strawn. In a moment, I will ask them to introduce themselves to all of you, but you'll see, I think, very quickly what a wealth of experience and expertise they bring to this topic, and I think will be quite helpful to all of us as we navigate these still extraordinary waters that we all live through at the moment. We, as we do every week, or every other week anyway, are here welcoming a really amazing set of organizations, literally from all over the world. So wherever you may be joining us from today, thank you for joining us. There's a wonderful mixture of members of the Advisory Board for the Arts, non-members, all sorts of types of organizations, again, from many different continents around the world. So we welcome you all. Thank you, whatever time zone you're in, for joining us. It is great to have you with us as always. This is a Zoom meeting. We are all very familiar with Zoom and probably can't even say the word anymore. You know all the protocols, you know how this works. The one thing I will remind you of is that we are keeping you on mute through this session. So really the primary way for you to communicate with us and our panelists and with each other is through the chat function. Please use it liberally. And we would encourage you right now, in fact, to just say hello to each other. Tell us where you're joining us from today and who you are. So you start to warm up those fingers as we get going with Zoom. Given that Zoom is such a big topic, it seems appropriate to begin actually with a quick first tip for this webinar. And the tip is as follows. We have uncovered through our conversations with our panelists that one of the sources of great fatigue, and we'll talk a little bit about exhaustion and fatigue, is in fact Zoom. And one of the things we were talking about that's interesting about Zoom in terms of what is so tiring about these meetings that we do endlessly every day is in fact something that maybe we don't always consider, which is that in doing so, we are looking at ourselves. And that is not something that is typical. When we have meetings one-on-one with people in live settings, in person, we don't look at ourselves. When we're on the phone, we don't look at ourselves. There is something about the psychology of seeing ourselves in Zoom that almost forces our mind to think differently. And we explain a little bit of what the rationale is, the psychological rationale for why it is so tiring to be constantly seeing ourselves. It gives us this sense of having to always be auditing, you know, do I look right, is the lighting right, all of that. It activates a different part of the brain that creates an additional layer of fatigue that really doesn't need to be there. So one simple trick is turn your video off. Turn yourself off. And so here's how to do that. Feel free to do it now if you'd like. When you see your picture on a Zoom call like this one, if you hover over your picture and then go to the three dots on the upper right-hand side of your box, you will see an option to hide self-view. I've tried it over the last few days, and it actually is amazing what a difference it makes. So I would just, again, this webinar is all going to be about tips and tricks for upping our energy level and preventing some of the extra fatigue that this world brings. So we thought we would start with that since we're talking about Zoom. Feel free to give it a try. It's an interesting trick, and I have found it useful over the last few days. With that, I would like to turn to our two panelists. We are so excited to have Brodie and Perry with us and thought I would just give them a minute to have them introduce themselves to you. Brodie, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. My name is Brodie Riordan, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. I'm an industrial psychologist. I'm a professor in the business school at University of Maryland and also at Georgetown University. I'm a leadership coach, and I've written a few books, mostly on the topic of feedback. I've most recently been part of McKinsey and Company, but recently left to start my own practice. And also, I just wanted to mention that when I was a kid, I was really active in theater, chorus. I played the cello, the piano, the drums. I even learned how to play the accordion. And I'm just really grateful for the work that all of you are doing. I know this is a hard time, and it's such an honor to be here with you today. And I hope that we can offer some advice and some help that's useful to everyone.
Thank you, Brodie. Perry?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, it is a real privilege and honor to be here. I'm an anthropologist turned leadership coach and consultant, and I also teach and practice mindfulness. And I worked for many years at the advisory board company in Washington, D.C., and recently, in the last couple of years, launched my own practice as a leadership coach and consultant and facilitator. I'm coming to you from outside of Philadelphia, where, as I'm sure many of you know, we have some fantastic arts organizations that enrich my life greatly. And I, too, have a lot of gratitude for your work and look forward to the conversation today. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Perry. We'll turn to Brodie and Perry in just a second. A little bit of context here and information for you in terms of resources available. First of all, this is a little bit of a different topic for us in some respects. We've been dealing with topics pertaining to arts organizations directly and uniquely, things about fundraising. We've been talking about reopening strategies. We've even been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion to an increasing extent over the last few weeks. But one thing that, as we think about and what we've heard from all of you around the world as your urgent issues at the moment, they almost always fall into one of these 6 categories. And to a certain extent, some of you have told us that your urgent priorities are in all 6. And we have organized our work with members around these 6 areas: digital, audience, donors, reopening, digital, DE&I. But a 6th piece that we believe to be just as critical as the first 5 is thinking about your organizational resilience, leadership, motivation, and teams at this time. You probably have never been through a period like this from a leadership standpoint, from a team motivation standpoint before in your lives. And it's important, in our opinion, to dedicate as much focus on that aspect of your work as on the first 5 that we've talked about. So it was really important for us to try to help our members and the broader arts world on issues pertaining to leadership at this critical point in time. We have organized a series of resources around this on our website. If you go to our topic center in the website on arts management, the Arts Management Center, you'll see a link to it in the chat room, in the chat function right here. Feel free to click on it at any point. You will see a number of resources around arts management in general, leadership specifically, and most specifically about leadership in this particular point in time. So what does motivation and leadership of our teams mean during the pandemic? There is a construct here that I will leave for your further review. You will get access to all of these slides as well in the next few days as we send a follow-up to this webinar to you on Monday. We think about it in the following categories: personal growth and self-care, yourself as a person, regardless of what level you are in your particular organization; trust and autonomy; compassionate coaching; flexible workplace culture; and finally, connecting to purpose. These are all, in our minds, part of a construct for how you can think about your role as a leader, but also your role as an individual within your organizations. And we will send you some resources to help you in each one of these 5 areas and encourage you to focus on that as you think about motivation and team management and self-management through the pandemic. With that, I want to start talking to our panelists in two principal categories. We're first going to explore the notion of managing people, managing teams, whether it's an entire organization or one person. And what does it mean in this uniquely strange and difficult time that we are all facing right now? As we do so, I want to quickly get a pulse of this room as to what are the key challenges that you are feeling in terms of managing other people right now. So if you could take a moment, let's look at this poll that we have up here, and I'd love for you to quickly answer that in terms of what do you think, what aspect of leading your team is most challenging for you right now? Feel free to start answering. Is it balancing the individual needs of people being considered and how you treat everyone? Is it having difficult conversations? Is it making time and figuring out how to connect one-on-one? Is it all of them, or is it something else altogether? And if it is, please make sure to put that into the chat room. We'd love to hear your particular thoughts as to what else is most challenging when it comes to managing teams. We'll take a couple of minutes here to or a couple of seconds to let folks answer that question. May not be the most straightforward answer because there are so many challenges associated with managing others and managing teams at this particular point in time. Take a look at other people's answers in the chat room. Having informal conversations and pop-up interactions, yes, for sure. Just figuring out how to keep everyone up to date as things change so quickly. It's like you have a meeting, you tell people on Tuesday one thing, and then by Friday everything else has changed, if not sooner. So Karen, maybe let's take a look at the results here. Let's folks digest a little bit of what we're saying. And it's a lot of things, right? Many people say it's everything. And that's part of the challenge itself, is how do you actually tackle everything? Having difficult conversations clearly is something that you find particularly complicated. So with that, I'm going to turn to Brodie, because for the next few minutes, we're going to discuss the unique issues and challenges of managing people and managing teams at this point. Brodie, any surprises or reactions to this poll as we get going?
Not at all, Chris. In fact, if you could see me smiling, I was watching the numbers as they came in and kept seeing all of the above tick up. And I'm also really grateful to people who typed a few things in the chat. I know, it's hard to just choose from 3 or 4 options, and the things that you typed into the chat add even a little bit more color to this. So this is really good. Thank you. What I'd love to do now is just share a few suggestions or practices that you might want to try as you're dealing with some of these complex issues, the need to really communicate with everyone, to manage expectations, to have difficult conversations in a really difficult environment, and to connect one-on-one with people in a way that's meaningful. So Karen, if we can move on to the next page. So 2 skills that can really help you work some magic, and they might seem a little bit basic when you look at them at first, but I want to talk about some nuances that can really help you in a lot of different situations with members of your team. One is listening, and the other is using open-ended questions. And these 2 skills are the heart of coaching. So if you think back to those 5 keys that Chris showed a few minutes ago, the third one was compassionate coaching. And these are 2 very specific skill sets that you can use to help you coach members of your team really effectively and manage some of these difficult situations. So first, I want to talk a bit about listening. And it's very easy to say, like, listening is really straightforward. We all have 2 ears, we can listen. But the question is, what are you listening for? And one of my favorite ways to think about listening is this framework called level 1 versus level 2 listening. Level 1 listening means that you are listening about yourself, even when you're listening to other people. You are listening to respond. You are listening to connect what someone else is saying to your own frame of reference. So this is something that could be casual conversation, right? So let's see, I run into Karen, I would say in the hallway, I run into Karen on Zoom. And I say, hey, Karen, how's it going? And she says, oh, I'm really good. I just got back. We took a little vacation. We got an Airbnb out in the country. It was just so nice to get away. An example of level 1 listening is when I respond back and say, oh, that's great. You know, I did the same thing back in July. I got an Airbnb out in the country too, and it was really nice to have a change of pace. So that's just casual conversation. The challenge with level 1 listening is that you're not going anywhere with it, right? It's almost like chit chat. Level 2 listening, on the other hand, is when it's really about the other person. You're listening to understand them, you stay focused on them, and this allows you to have deeper conversation to draw the other person out and leave them feeling heard and understood. So to use our vacation example again, so Karen says, I got this Airbnb out the country and it was great. An example of a level 2 response would be if I say, oh, wow, Karen, that sounds wonderful. What was the best part of getting out of town? So I ask her an open-ended question that stays focused on her and moves the conversation on to the next level of detail to learn about her vacation. I know you're probably talking about things much more consequential than vacations right now, but the point of this example is that you can really help your team members if they are feeling strained, exhausted, anxious, uncertain, by using level 2 listening to really understand what's going on with them and also help them feel heard. So it's a generous way of listening. And the perfect complement to using real listening is using open-ended questions. And my advice is to focus on what and how questions, or even things as simple as tell me more, and to stay curious. You want to avoid closed-ended questions that people can answer with yes or no. And I also recommend avoiding why questions because they can sometimes feel judgmental, like people have to justify whatever it is that they're sharing with you. And engaging in dialogue like this will really help you connect with people to get underneath the surface of challenges that they're having. It can be really easy to focus on presenting or surface level symptoms of challenges that they're facing. And if you just take those at face value, you might not actually be able to get at the root cause. By asking some of these questions, you can peel back the layers and really understand what's going on with members of your team, whether it's with respect to their performance, challenges that they're having balancing work and life, emotional or physical or mental strain or exhaustion that they're facing just from dealing with all the uncertainty and complexity of the world right now.
Brodie, a question about this, since I'm sure this technique of level 2 listening is particularly important at this juncture, given the current circumstances and given some of the issues that you highlighted are unique to the pandemic. These types of conversations are always not easy to have, and they're always better in person. And some of you around the world are able to have these one-on-one conversations in person. But for those of us who cannot and who have to do it in a virtual environment, do you have recommendations on whether it's better to do this in person over Zoom or in a phone call, for instance? And are there circumstances where you would encourage us to manage our teams in a different and kind way?
Chris, there are pros and cons to both. So I'm going to give you my favorite psychologist answer, which is it depends. A few things to consider. So one thing that I really like about Zoom is I can see people's facial expressions and their body language, which adds a whole other level of depth. I find it easier to connect with people when I can see their faces. And I also recognize that a lot of people are experiencing Zoom fatigue. So my advice is if you're going to connect one-on-one with someone, ask them what their preference is. You could suggest something like, let's go on a walk together. So you both are on your phone, get your headphones, go for a walk around the block, around the neighborhood, and then you're both on the phone. Neither of you can see one another, but you're out there, you're getting some movement, and you're connecting in a way that's comfortable for you. So really the right answer is what works best for the person that you're connecting with in the current situation.
Well, I know that, thank you, that's very helpful. It actually brings us to, I think, where we were gonna go next, which is that the nature of some of these conversations these days is difficult, right? They're not sort of how was your vacation, as you point out. It's furloughs, layoffs, or really tough topics about grief and performance and things like that. Do you have any advice that is unique to those types of conversations that you'd like to share with us?
I absolutely do. And I know that this is a really, really hard time for people, and there's such a mix of emotions that people are experiencing. So a few things to consider, both for yourself and also for the people that you're working with. One is emotions are very powerful, and especially right after something happens, you will have a very strong spike in your emotion. And it actually is very hard to think rationally when you're having strong emotions. And so time is always on your side when it comes to dealing with difficult situations and difficult conversations. This is why we say things like count to 10 when you're angry, right? So sometimes you just need to give some time to let the emotion pass. Even with things like grief, so if you are experiencing furloughs or layoffs, it's not at all unusual for people who are still with the organization to basically experience survivor's guilt or feel some grief for the change that's taking place. And one of the most important things to keep in mind when you are experiencing feelings like this is not to suppress them, but to really be with those feelings, recognize that you're going to pass through a series of different emotions, and to do your best to feel the emotions that you're experiencing, let them kind of run their course, see what you can learn from them. And just know that, this is hard to say, but with time, they're going to pass and you're going to be able to think differently about the situation.
I know you've written significantly about the topic of feedback, and that you're sort of a great expert on that. Any lessons from your work on how to give feedback to people that you think you'd like to share that is applicable to the current situation and managing teams?
Absolutely. And in fact, Karen, if we go to the next page, there are a few very concrete things I'd like to share. And some of the things on this page are very relevant, not only to feedback, but also to difficult conversations or managing expectations with people where it's not going as smoothly as you would like. On the left-hand side of the page, you can see 3 images. And to me, these represent the 3 things that are so valuable about feedback. On the top side, you can see the diagram that shows current state, desired state, and the distance in between. Feedback is a really valuable source of information to help us understand the distance between where we are and where we want to be. So especially when you're in an environment now where things are changing very rapidly, you might have to pivot very quickly. People's job responsibilities are evolving all of the time as these changes unfold. This framework can help people think about, okay, this is where I am. This is what I'm trying to achieve, where I'm trying to get. What do I need to do to close that gap? And thinking about feedback in this way can make it feel a little less daunting. So someone mentioned like having difficult conversations when you're in a really difficult environment. If you frame the way you're thinking about feedback, that you're helping people adapt to the change and to still have good performance despite all of the circumstances, something like this might help you frame your feedback. This is also helpful because that desired state basically represents some goal that you have. And in order to make things feel more manageable amidst all of this change and chaos, you can do things like set micro goals to make those gaps feel a little bit smaller. So if you're trying to launch some significant initiative, break it down into milestones and micro goals so that you're working toward those in smaller intervals and you can feel the satisfaction of achieving a goal every time you hit one of those. The other 2 images you can see, one is someone holding up the mirror and the other is the change in the same button. And feedback is basically a great tool to help us understand what we're doing well, what we could be doing better or differently, what we might need to keep doing more of or even ramp up or change. And so as you're thinking about still managing people's performance, keeping them motivated and inspired, helping them acclimate to changes in the organization and in their roles, feedback is a really valuable tool that you can use. And on the right-hand side of the page, you can see 4 very specific ways that giving feedback and having difficult conversations can be a little bit easier. So one is being as specific as possible and always evidence-based. So you want to focus on things that you can see with your eyes, not opinions, generalizations, or assumptions about things that are happening in someone's head. So if one of your team members is dropping the ball on something, you don't want to say, Karen, you just haven't been performing at the same level recently. You know, Karen, you're great. It's not you. I just keep looking at you. You'd want to talk about specifically what it is that they are doing differently or haven't been doing quite as well, or that you want to see them do differently to pivot. The second one is to always focus your feedback, sorry, that's a typo, feedback on their behavior, not on the person. So this is whether it's positive feedback or constructive feedback. You always want to focus on what they did or do, not who they are. And a lot of times this surprises people with positive feedback, because I think it's good to praise someone for their abilities or their talents or their character. But you're actually more likely to see them repeat good behaviors if you focus on what they did as opposed to who they are. The third thing is to provide feedback as soon as possible, but make sure you're in private. So if you see that someone is, taking advantage of working remotely and they're not getting things done and they're not showing up in the way that you want them to, make sure that you get out ahead of it as soon as you can. Don't let it drag on. And also, whatever you do, don't say it to them in front of other people. And then my last recommendation is to make your feedback forward-looking, especially right now when people have so much emotional stress. They can't do anything about stuff that has happened in the past. So if you want to see people changing aspects of their performance or the way that they're working, frame it like it's a suggestion for next time. Like, Karen, in last week's meeting, it was really hard to hear you. Your Zoom setup was a little weird. You were mumbling. When you present again next week, try testing out your Zoom setup ahead of time and make sure you're looking up and looking into the camera, not just down at your notes the whole time, so that people can really hear you. So those are just a few tips that, as you are going into potentially murky or challenging situations, these are some things that you can try to make it feel a little less uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Karen is a very good sport.
Thank you. That's incredibly interesting, Brodie. And there's the wonderful questions that are coming through the chat room, and I want to address one to you specifically, which is, as you're giving feedback and you're working with people, oftentimes you are doing so in order to set goals and to talk about, what's next. And the point that Kurt mentions and asks essentially is, but in this environment, it's so fluid. The goals change from one week to the other. So how do you do that effectively? How do you manage that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. My biggest piece of advice is recognize that goals can be flexible. Just because you set a goal doesn't mean that you're beholden to it. As the circumstances change, you might need to revise your goals. And so I would encourage you to take a very dynamic approach to goal setting. You use the information that is at your disposal right now and do the best that you can. And then have frequent conversations and communication about how things have changed that might be impacting that goal. This is also where things like micro goals can be really helpful. So you might be setting goals for next year, but you have no idea what the world is going to be like this time next summer. You could set some milestones for months leading up to the goals for next year that you can still work toward, and they can guide your performance and your behavior. And you're not beholden to them if they're simply not feasible given changes in the ecosystem.
Right. Thank you. Perry, I want to turn to you for a second before we move on to our next topic. And we've talked now a lot about working with people, giving them feedback, communicating with them. Any reactions from your own experiences and research and work that you'd like to share? Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Well, two things that struck me as Brodie was speaking in particular. One, going back to her model of level 1 and level 2 listening, that part where you ask that question to dig into a little more detail, what was the best thing, what was the hardest thing, is a way to demonstrate empathy. And that's so important right now. It's a very simple way, but when you ask a question like that, it shows the other person that you are really paying attention. And it is a way in this kind of awkward, not in real life format to demonstrate empathy. So that was a thought that came to mind, and I really appreciated that model. And then secondly, I want to pile on as an advocate for dynamic goal setting and say, could we think of things as experiments? We're putting a goal out there, we're taking a step. Is it working? We're getting some input from what we tried. Working, not, okay, we're going to make a shift. It's, I think it is a new way of working all the time right now, making experience, testing, making a shift and moving forward. So just advocating for that sense of dynamic goal setting flexibility.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Perry. We're going to shift our focus now in the spirit of the airline safety videos, put on your mask first, and then you can take care of your children and others. It is just as important in this extraordinary time to focus on oneself. And I want to turn to one of the most important tenets of motivating others, which is how do you motivate yourself? How do you create energy for yourself? How do you assess how you are doing as a leader, as a means of not only helping yourself, but helping others that you are working with day in, day out. So I want to start by introducing a model that I believe you work directly on at McKinsey, Brodie, that you're going to just help us kind of begin to think about how one thinks about oneself.
Absolutely. So self-management and thinking about your energy can be hard when you're basically operating in survival mode. But I'm sure as many of you are finding, you can only sustain yourself in survival mode for so long. And so what you can see on the screen here is a framework that we use frequently at McKinsey and Company, and it's available to the public. There's a link down at the bottom if you are interested in reading more about this. And we basically found that your energy or lack thereof is often a result of alignment or misalignment between a few key elements of your work and life. And Perry is going to talk in a minute much more about energy. So I'm going to focus on some things that lead up to it, and then she'll take us deeper on that. So what we found is that your priorities, your roles, and your time really need to be in alignment in order for you to feel like things are operating on all cylinders and for you to maintain your energy. And when we think about your priorities, this means things like not just do you have the right priorities, but how many priorities do you have? Are you actually prioritizing? Do you have priorities that are in conflict with one another? And how have your priorities shifted given the rapid changes that are occurring in the world around us? The second dimension is the roles that you take on. And this isn't just formal roles at work. This is any role that you have in your life. So it could be whatever your formal job is at work, any sort of informal roles that you have in your organization. Being a parent is a role, being a spouse, a child, a sibling. Those are all roles that you take on. And ultimately, your roles should be supporting your priorities. And so if you're filling roles that are totally disconnected from your priorities, you're going to feel some tension there. Another thing that's really important here is thinking about the way that your roles have shifted. And I think a really great example is if you have children, the way parenting what parenting looks like right now is very different. For some of you, parenting might also include homeschooling because your kids are doing Zoom school at home. And so as you're having significant changes and evolutions with your roles, that could also introduce some strain in the system. And then the last dimension is your time. And in an ideal world, when, where, and how you're spending your time support your priorities and the roles that you have. But if you find that some of those are sucking up way too much time and there's imbalance, or if you're spending your time on things that don't align with your priorities or your roles, again, that's going to create some tension and some strain for you, and you're going to feel it in your energy levels. So energy can be a great way to sort of get a sense of where you are, and then you can take a step back and think about these three elements and see where you might have some conflict. This is something that you can use for yourself and also for your teams. And now I think Perry is going to go deep on some energy best practices and help us learn a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Brodie. Yes, I think, again, one of the things that we've been hearing almost every day from talking to each one of you around the world is regardless of who you are, regardless of where you are, there's this sense of overwhelming exhaustion and sort of this almost close to burnout in some cases, whether it is self-recognized or not in some cases. And so we thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about this question of personal energy and how one sustains it at a time, frankly, when the environment is asking us to be at our very best, not to be simply okay or good, but truly have to step up to be at the best that we've ever been in our lives. So let's examine this initially by, again, taking the pulse of this room. How are you feeling about your personal energy right now? And this is anonymous, so you can self-confess to whatever aspect of this. We're curious, and you can choose the one that feels most aligned to your particular feeling at this point. And it might have been interesting actually to look at this and see its evolution across the last 6 months. And we will reveal kind of where we come out in just a second. Let's see, let's give it a few more seconds. We have still a few folks who haven't had a chance to self-assess their own energy levels and how the environment is impacting them right now. So let's give ourselves another 5-10 seconds. If you want to choose your best description of energy level. Very good, Karen, why don't we take a look at the results? And here we are. So I want to talk to the 3 people who thrive in chaos. I want to hear all about you and your energy and what you bring to the table. So thankfully, we have a very solid group who refers to being having good days and bad days, but finding ways, which is fantastic. But obviously a pretty substantial group that's telling us that their energy is almost completely drained or completely drained. And that's not a good place to be in, but it's also not at all surprising. So Perry, let's begin with any thoughts and reactions to what we're hearing from the room.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for your answers to the poll. Speaking of Zoom awkwardness, I didn't have my sound on. Well, sadly, I'm not surprised to see the answers where people are expressing that they feel spent or depleted. This is something I'm hearing from leaders that I work with, regardless of the organization they're in, the type of organization, the size of organization. It's a real challenge. Facing the pandemic and addressing the long-standing issues of social justice in our communities, those issues, and combined with the length of this time that we've been working in this way, have pushed a lot of leaders and organizations to a breaking point. And Karen, I'm wondering if we could go to the next slide. I think maybe many of us feel like this fellow, sort of at the end of our rope, possibly. One thing that I really want to offer is a way to think about what is coming at us. And there's a framework actually that the Advisory Board for the Arts did a webinar about earlier this season. So I want to refer you to that. It's about this framework called VUCA. This term was developed by the US military actually to describe the global situation following the end of the Cold War. It was picked up by business thinkers in the late 20th century to describe the complex situations that most business leaders found themselves in. If anybody right now doesn't feel like we're in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, yes, I really would like to talk to you. So this is the external situation that is facing us and is related to this sense of depletion and exhaustion. I would like to say, I also am very interested in and curious about the experience of the people who said they thrive in chaos. And just a question I have is curious about, if there's a toll that's being taken. Often people who do thrive in chaos move into doing mode. And that can take a toll. Yeah.
So Perry, I think we want to talk about burnout. How does one sustain ourselves? We're going to talk in a moment about attention and the issue of focus. This is a strange world we live in that we are on the one hand depleted and we're having difficulty and we have to deal with VUCA. But as I said a minute ago, we're also being told that we are at the critical, most important turning point for the arts, which again means that we have to be at our very best. This is the moment in time when we have to be A+, where we cannot afford to be anything less than A+. Yeah. How do you reconcile those things? How do you create sustainable energy? How do you create an ability to be unprecedentedly focused and have attention on the key elements that need to be addressed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those questions are so important. I do want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about what is actually going on in ourselves. The VUCA framework talks about all of the external things coming at us, yet there is what is inside of ourselves and how we're responding. And we are biologically hardwired to scan the environment for threat and opportunity all the time. Unfortunately, pretty much since the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us have been more or less in a constant perception of threat mode, whether it's, is our business going to be able to keep operating? Can we keep the lights on? What about the stress of work and home colliding? What about the existential threat of the pandemic and a worry about the safety of ourselves and loved ones? And this is often going on without our conscious awareness. So in the back of our brains, there's worry, there's anxiety, and while that's going on, that takes up a lot of our mental capacity. There are many research studies showing now, Daniel Kahneman, I'm sure you're all familiar with him, started this idea of this sort of working memory and how the capacity can be diminished. So when you go to the well and find it empty, yes, that is actually a biological response. And so I just want to frame that context so we can understand what's going on inside of ourselves. And certainly facing the relentless uncertainty that we all are also causes that sense of anxiety and worry that again is ever present. So we really are capacity constrained. What to do? How can we maintain our energy levels? Well, I want to offer just a very simple framework related to energy, and Brodie introduced this idea of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual or purpose energy already. And I find this pyramid can be helpful in framing this to ourselves. This comes from an article, which I would also recommend, almost 20 years old now, but still so helpful, called The Corporate Athlete. The idea, of course, is that fundamentally we must take care of our physical energy before anything else. And I noticed that Joel in the chat has spoken to this really perfectly. I want to place an idea here for all of your consideration, this idea of a resilience bank account. And this idea was developed by a physician, Dr. Michael Mattis. He had a series of life-challenging issues that got him thinking and researching about this issue of resilience. And basically the idea is that we do practices and habits and develop rituals that are inputs into that bank of resilience, if you will, so that when we go to the well, we have something to be able to meet the challenges we're facing. And physical energy is fundamental, of course. Exercise, taking care of what we eat and drink, and sleeping, very, very fundamental. Those are all big things. I'm here today to offer a few micro practices that you can drop in across your day. And so with regard to physical energy, the micro practice I want to offer is, if you can, a couple times across your day, go outside, look up at the sky, which if I pretend I'm doing this here in my office, opens your heart, and just take a few breaths. It causes an energetic shift. It allows you to connect to something bigger than yourself, and opens that space in your chest, which again, you'd be surprised what a difference that can make. Chris, you asked me about attention and about that, how do we stay focused? And so I wanted to transition to that. Again, the challenges we're facing, external and internal, are a real challenge, both to regulating our emotions effectively and keeping focused on things and focused for a certain amount of time for the time we need. Brodie mentioned already in her conversation and remarks, emotion is coming up for all of us. I just want to ask, any of you found yourself short-tempered during this period? Or maybe my personal favorite, not my husband's favorite, I have to say, crying uncontrollably for no apparent reason. These things are happening. So there's a lot that frankly could be said about emotional regulation, but the one thing I just want to say here is, can we notice what's going on, and could we have a practice to stop ourselves in that moment, especially if we're reactive or if we notice strong emotion coming up, because for sure that can get in the way of our operating at the level we need to. So I'm just going to right here offer a second micro practice, and I'm going to suggest that maybe you all just try it right here while we're here. It has to do with using your breath. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is breathe in and then exhale for twice as long as you breathe in. So count 4 as you breathe in, and as you breathe out, count to 8. So let's all do this right now together. Breathing in, counting 4. Breathing out, counting 8. And if you felt any shift at all in your energy, let us know in the chat. The idea here is to cause a pause so you can interrupt that emotional reactivity that might have gotten in your way and allow you to get access to your prefrontal cortex, which is what you need to do and say and think clearly. I'm just going to pause there, Chris. I've been talking a lot. I want to talk a little more about mental energy, but any comments or questions, or any questions from folks in the audience about this?
Well, I think there's definitely a lot of interest in anything that can help at this point. You know, one of the pieces that I think is interesting is the ability to have a space to recognize these things that are going on, right? And to be able to put a name on them, to be able to identify them. Do you have any advice for those of us, I will count myself as the first one of these, who kind of doesn't really think about it? Like, yeah, things are tough. You know, I'm sure it's hard. It's normal that I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling exhausted, but I'm not really thinking truly about what's going on. Maybe I'm not fully self-aware as to the toll it's taking on me, and therefore the need to do something differently about it. What do you have, any advice for those of us who perhaps are in that side of the matrix, and what we should do about it?
Mm-hmm. Creating an opportunity for yourself to check in and see how you're doing is probably one of the most important things you could do. And so people have different ways of doing this. Some of my clients actually get a rubber bracelet or something to remind themselves. Some people have calendar reminders. You mentioned the idea of putting on our oxygen mask before we help others. For leaders in complex organizations right now, it's so important. So what is a way that works for you to check in? How am I doing? How am I doing physically? Where am I emotionally? What's my tone? What's my affect? Am I able to focus in the way I need to? If not, what might I do about it? And then am I staying connected to purpose? I also personally love, and I would be curious to hear from Brodie about this, I love the discipline of a daily intention setting. This is not a to-do list, but this is a, what do I intend to do today? How do I intend to be? I do this myself, and it's surprising how just by shifting our attention a little bit to, today I'm going to be open to what arises. Today I'm going to speak more clearly. Today I need to approach my day with courage. Whatever that is, it is, when we point our attention, we can go in that direction. And it's a very small, quick practice that can be helpful. Brodie, thoughts from your end on that?
Perry, I totally agree. And, you know, I think what you're suggesting, and as well as some of the other advice that you're giving, is really aligned to some of the core principles of positive psychology. A lot of times people have a misconception that positive psychology means that we should be happy all the time. But what positive psychology is really all about is being fully present and authentic in our lives, whatever is happening. And when you're in times of crisis and stress, it can be very tempting to kind of go on autopilot, avoid those challenging emotions, and shut down certain parts of your mind and your feelings. But actually, I think you'll find it's easier to navigate if you instead focus on being very present, noticing what's happening with you, being deliberate and intentional, like Perry said, setting an intention for the day, finding points in the day to check in with yourself. If you find that you are feeling stress, anxiety, anger, fear, sadness, whatever it is, notice that and say, wow, I'm feeling really angry about this, and sit with it. And the worst thing that you can do is try and suppress it or make some impulsive choices in that moment. So really noticing where you are, being deliberate and intentional, and knowing that this situation is not going to be here forever. This is a very challenging time. You're going to learn a lot from it. It's hard. You're going to grow as a result, and sort of taking it day by day, even though it could be really challenging in some of those moments.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brodie. Perry, we sort of on the heels of the question I just asked, an excellent question from Shelley, which is that oftentimes the outcome of the stress that we are dealing with is not one that is anticipated, but one that just, as you say, you're uncontrollably starting to cry. Like, where did that come from? You know, how do you, or can you even get ahead of it, diagnose it almost for yourself ahead of time before it manifests itself in short-temperedness, in, you know, episodes of crying, or in worse ways?
Yeah. So and I want to actually go on to the next slide because that's relevant to this, what I'd like to say. You do have a tool handy that you can use to help you pay more attention. And actually, no, it's not this ruler. And could you click through? The slide has one more thing. We all have two kinds of attention. One kind of attention is meta attention, which is what allowed you, after you started looking at the ruler, to then notice my hand and then bring your attention back. It's how we know we've lost track. It's how we know we're off course. It helps us pay attention to what is going on. And then it allows us to be choiceful and intentional and relate more skillfully. And this is really what we're up to when we say things like connect with yourself, be more present. And if we could have the next slide, please. We really want to make a shift from being on autopilot to being aware. And if there's nothing you take away from what we've said today, but this one thing, in my view, is probably the most important, is causing yourself to take a pause. Even my saying that, I bet, made you pause. Take a pause. Take a breath. Feel yourself in your body. And that will settle your nervous system if it's been agitated. But it also, again, gives us access to our intelligence to say, oh, wow, that's really upsetting, or I'm having a reaction, or I need to lean in more with this member or this teammate, whatever it is. But it's how do we create spaces throughout our day, again, with these micro practices, because you're all very busy, I know, to hit refresh and, again, access what's inside of us that knows what's to do to make a choice and be intentional. And so that's really my advocacy for this time. Yep.
Thank you, Perry.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, you know, even just, I'll self-confess, you asked me to pause and it makes me feel uncomfortable at first, right? Because that is not what we are necessarily, you know, used to. And so there is a certain amount of, speaking of awareness, of being aware that some of the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves and take care of our team members may not be the most familiar or comfortable things to do, but the recognition of the value of doing them is definitely important and valuable. With 4 minutes left, I want to just turn back to both of you and say, is there anything we have not talked about that you would like to share with this group? Any additional tips, ideas? Again, our audience, the folks on this call, are working so hard and have such enormous challenges ahead of them, and yet have to deal with all the pressures that we've been talking about. And having to marry those two is truly difficult, is truly unprecedented. I think what you both have shared with us today is incredibly valuable. Is there anything we've missed that you'd like to say in our last 2 or 3 minutes together from either of you? Perry, I'll start with you.
Yes, I do want to make a plea also for all of the leaders on this call to practice a bit of self-compassion, to give yourself a moment of grace. You all are working very hard. You have a big challenge and such a worthy one. And can you allow yourself to be your own friend? What would you say to your best friend? Say that to yourself. And just that moment of taking care to be kind to yourself can be helpful in facing these times.
Thank you. Brodie, any final thoughts from you?
I'll just give a thumbs up to what Perry said. And, I think the oxygen mask metaphor is such an important one here, right? You really have to take care of yourself before you're able to take care of your teams. And I know in this situation, it started out, we thought it was going to be a sprint and it's turned out to be a marathon. So just make sure you're adjusting the way that you're running so that you're not sprinting a marathon, because that's a really fast way to encounter burnout. The only other thing I would say is, times like this can open up some doors and opportunities for changes that you might want to make. And so even though most of it is scary and challenging and full of a handbasket of negative emotions, where you can, see if you can find some opportunities, whether it's to change the way that you work with some of the members of your team, processes that you use in your organization, moving some things around. In chaos, there is sometimes opportunity. And that might be the last thing that you want to hear today. But I would just encourage you to take that growth mindset and think about what could be possible despite all of the challenge.
Thank you, Brodie. Thank you for these positive words. My last comment is simply going back to a place where I started in terms of the construct of things that you all have to deal with as an industry right now. We normally in these webinars talk about helping you figure out how to raise more money, how to understand your audience, how to develop your digital strategies, how to rise to the challenge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are absolutely the critical goals and objectives that you all are working on. But we want and felt very strongly about elevating this sixth element to the level of all these others. It is just as important to your ultimate success to think and give space to this notion of what does leadership look like today, and how do you successfully lead an enterprise through an unprecedented crisis like this. We are committed to helping our members and you to the extent that we can do that, and we will continue to make resources available in this vein. We will send you on Monday a spotlight newsletter that will have all of the summaries of this webinar, links to resources, frameworks, and we'll give you the opportunity to also forward this to your peers, teammates, and colleagues if you are interested. We make all of this available on our website. This has been fantastic. Brodie and Perry, what wonderful panelists. We could not have asked two more fantastic people to join us. We appreciate it so much. All of your advice has been so helpful. Thank you for your time. Thank you to all our participants for being here, for joining us. Stay safe, healthy, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.